Right, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
The book of Leviticus.
Leviticus.
Now, when you hear that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what comes to mind?
I mean, it depends who you ask, but a lot of people, I think, immediately think,
Yeah.
thou shalt not this and thou shalt not that and all that.
Real rules, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Instructions, maybe a little sacrifice thrown in there.
Yeah, a lot of instructions about how to perform sacrifices, right?
Exactly.
What kind of animal to choose. And
Right. So we're going to dig into Leviticus, but we're going to go a little deeper.
Yeah.
We're going to try to unpack some of the hidden meanings and really kind of get at what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I guess let's just jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're going to be working with the King James version of the Bible, by the way.
Sounds good.
So I guess let's start with those sacrifices because, I mean, that's one of the things that people tend to think of when they think about Leviticus. But, I mean, there's a whole system. Yeah, it's not just one kind of sacrifice. You've got your burnt offerings, you've got your meat offerings, you've got peace offerings, sin offerings.
Well, and each one's got, it's not just, hey, offer an animal. It's very specific.
Oh, yeah.
Down to the gender of the animal, whether it has blemishes or not.
Yeah, how you prepare it, the way you lay your hand on the head.
Yeah. What's all that about? I mean, why so much detail?
Well, I think it has to do with symbolic action. It's not just about, like you said, following a recipe.
Right.
Every detail is imbued with meaning. And, you mentioned laying on of hands. That's a great example, right?
Yeah.
It's a physical act, signifying transference.
Right.
You're placing your sins or impurities onto that animal.
So it's almost like a stand-in for you.
Yeah.
In the ritual.
Exactly.
Now, and then there's the blood. Leviticus talks about blood a lot.
Mm-hmm.
What's the significance of blood in these sacrifices?
Well, I mean, I think if you think about it, blood represents life itself, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's essential.
Yeah. And so, sprinkling the blood on the altar, it's a way of offering that life force back to God.
Okay.
It's a powerful act of seeking atonement, seeking reconciliation.
It's interesting because it's like you're giving back the most valuable thing.
Yeah.
Right. And Leviticus also talks about the fat, and that is reserved for God.
Right.
So what's the deal with that?
Yeah, well, fat, like blood, was considered, the most valuable part of the animal.
Okay.
It symbolized vitality and richness. And so by offering it exclusively to God, the Israelites were, demonstrating their devotion,
right,
recognizing the source of all abundance.
It's like giving the best.
Yeah, the first fruits.
Right.
Yeah.
The best of what you have.
Exactly.
So you mentioned atonement earlier. What did that actually mean for the Israelites? And how did it connect with their relationship with God?
Yeah, so atonement wasn't just about saying sorry.
Right.
It was about repairing a broken relationship.
Okay.
They believed that, sin created a separation between them and God.
Right.
And these sacrifices were a way to bridge that gap.
Okay.
To restore harmony.
So it was about making things right again.
Yeah, exactly. Seeking forgiveness and restoring a sense of rightness within themselves and in their relationship with God.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, this idea of atonement through sacrifice. You see it in other cultures, right?
Oh, you see it all over the place. The ancient world is full of examples of this.
So it's almost like this universal human desire to make things right when you feel like you've messed up.
Exactly. Appease the divine.
Exactly.
We're all trying to, get back in good graces.
Yeah, make things right.
Right.
So speaking of rituals, Leviticus talks a lot about the priests.
Yeah.
Why were they so important?
Well, you got to think about them as intermediaries between God and the people. Right. They're the ones responsible for carrying out these intricate rituals.
Right.
Making sure every detail is observed.
Okay.
Acting as that bridge between the human and divine.
It's a pretty big responsibility.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And Leviticus is very specific about their duties.
Mm-hmm.
From sprinkling the blood to burning the offerings. It seems like their role was very structured.
It was. Their actions were meticulously prescribed because they believed that the efficacy of the ritual, its power to achieve atonement,
right,
to appease God, depended on their precise execution.
So it's not just about going through the motions, it's about doing it right.
Right, yeah, with intention and precision.
Now, their clothing, they wore those holy linen garments, right?
Yeah.
Anointing oil, I mean, that's pretty symbolic.
Oh, absolutely. Their attire was a visual marker of their sacred status, setting them apart from the rest of the community. I mean, linen, for example,
Yeah.
associated with purity,
Okay.
holiness. And then the anointing oil symbolized divine selection, empowerment. It's like, being set apart for a special purpose.
So when they put those clothes on,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like they were entering into a different space.
A different realm.
Yeah, a sacred space.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now Leviticus also talks about purity and uncleanliness, and it's not just about physical hygiene.
Right. For the Israelites, purity was about maintaining a right relationship with God. And that encompasses every aspect of life.
Okay.
The physical, the ritual, and even the moral.
Okay.
Certain things were seen as sources of impurity, requiring specific rituals to restore balance.
So, let's unpack some of these purity laws because
Yeah.
some of them seem a little odd to us today.
Sure.
For example, Leviticus talks about bodily discharges, rendering someone unclean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was that just about hygiene, or was there a deeper meaning?
Well, hygiene was certainly a factor, but I think it went beyond that.
Okay.
Remember, they believed that any disruption of the natural order
Right.
could impact their spiritual state.
Their relationship with God.
So even something as natural as bodily function
Exactly.
could be disrupted.
Right.
Okay.
So these rituals were about restoring harmony,
Sure.
aligning themselves with the divine order.
Interesting. So they're trying to reestablish that sense of balance.
Yeah.
Okay. And Leviticus even outlines different rituals, right?
Yeah.
For different sources of uncleanliness.
For sure.
And they even use specific ingredients, cedarwood, scarlet, hyssop.
Yeah, and those all probably had symbolic significance.
Okay.
Cedarwood, for instance, known for its cleansing properties.
Right.
Fragrance representing purity and connection to the divine.
Interesting.
Scarlet thread,
Yeah.
maybe symbolizing the blood of sacrifice, a reminder of the cost of atonement.
Okay.
And then hyssop, this fragrant herb,
Right.
possibly representing healing and restoration.
So it's like they're taking their beliefs and acting them out through these
Yeah.
physical rituals.
Yeah, embodying it. Right?
Yeah. And physical objects. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so they're not just following rules.
Mm-hmm.
They're participating in a system of meaning
Yeah.
that connects them with God, connects them with each other.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered offerings, atonement, the role of the priests, even touched on those purity laws.
Yeah, those are fascinating.
Yeah, but there's more to Leviticus
Right.
than just those rules and rituals.
It's more than just a rule book, right?
Right.
Yeah,
It also lays out a whole set of social and moral laws.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these cover a wide range of topics, everything from respecting parents to prohibitions against stealing and lying,
Mm-hmm.
and, even guidelines for treating the poor and vulnerable justly.
So it's not just about personal piety.
Right.
It's about creating a whole society
Yeah, a just and compassionate society.
that reflects God's values.
Exactly.
Now, before we dive into those, what are some of the key things you think we should keep in mind as we explore Leviticus?
Well, I think first and foremost, remember context is key. These texts were written thousands of years ago
Right.
in a very different cultural and historical setting,
Yeah.
Second, I think it's important to look beyond the surface.
Okay.
Don't just focus on the what of the laws, but consider the why,
Right.
the underlying principles, the symbolic meanings, the deeper values
Okay.
they reflect.
So it's not just what they did, but why they did it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, be open to being challenged.
Right.
Leviticus can be a tough read
Yeah.
at times, but it also offers some profound insights,
Okay.
into the human condition and our search for meaning and connection.
So it's about understanding, not just judging,
Right, right.
and being willing to kind of look at things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And with that in mind, I think we're ready to jump into the next part of our deep dive,
All right, let's do it.
where we'll explore the social and moral dimensions of Leviticus
Okay.
and see what they can teach us about building a more just and compassionate world.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. All right, welcome back.
Okay, so last time we kind of set the stage with Leviticus, all about those offerings and the role of the priest.
Right, all those rituals.
Right, exactly. We talked about those purity laws, but today I really want to dive into those social and moral laws
Yeah, let's get into it.
that we touched on.
Yeah, it's a whole other dimension.
Right, exactly. So where do we even begin? Leviticus covers so much ground.
Well, maybe we could start with something as fundamental as food.
Food.
Yeah, you might be surprised to learn that there's a whole chapter dedicated to dietary laws.
Really?
Yeah, distinguishing between clean and unclean animals.
So it's not just about the sacrifices. There are rules about everyday eating.
Absolutely. And these dietary laws, they're about more than just hygiene or practicality.
Okay.
They reflect a worldview where certain animals were seen as inherently sacred or profane,
Okay.
and consuming them, it carried spiritual weight, maintaining a state of ritual purity, a separation between the Israelites and the practices of other nations.
So, I mean, what are we talking about here? What makes an animal clean or unclean?
Well, it's pretty specific for a land animal.
Yeah, okay.
You know, the criteria are split hooves and chewing the cud.
Okay, so cows, sheep, those are good.
Yeah, those get the green light.
Okay,
But things like pigs and camels, off the menu.
interesting. Any idea why those particular characteristics were so important?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's probably a blend of factors.
Ah.
Observations of animal behavior, existing cultural beliefs, even practical considerations like hygiene.
Right, because they didn't have our scientific understanding.
Exactly.
So it's this mix of kind of symbolic meaning and also just pragmatic concerns.
Yeah, totally.
And it gets even more specific, right?
It does.
I mean, for sea creatures.
Yeah, you can only eat fish with fins and scales.
Okay.
So shellfish, eels, anything without those were off limits.
Okay, so that rules out a lot of seafood.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. What about birds? Does Leviticus have anything to say about which birds are kosher?
Yeah, it does, and it gets really interesting here
Okay.
because the list of forbidden birds includes things like eagles, vultures, owls,
Okay.
even bats. And a lot of these birds,
Yeah.
they were associated with death, darkness, scavenging.
Right. Things that would have been seen as unclean.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's like a whole system of symbolism
Mm-hmm.
embedded in their food choices.
Yeah, it's not just about what you eat, it's about the meaning behind it.
Yeah, I remember reading that Leviticus repeatedly forbids eating blood.
Right.
What was the significance of that?
Yeah, well, blood for the Israelites, it represented life itself, and they believed that life belonged to God.
Right.
And consuming blood was seen as a violation of that.
So even in something as, I guess, basic as eating,
Mm-hmm.
there's this awareness of the divine,
Right.
this recognition that all life is a gift.
Yeah, exactly.
And Leviticus even goes further
It does.
and talks about what happens when an animal dies naturally.
Right, or is killed by a wild animal.
Right.
That meat is also considered unclean.
Okay. So again, this very clear delineation
Mm-hmm.
between life and death and how.
Yeah, that distinction was really important to them.
Right. Even the manner in which an animal died could affect
Yeah.
whether or not you could eat it.
Right, right.
So it's like every aspect of life is infused with this spiritual awareness.
Right.
Okay, now Leviticus doesn't shy away from talking about sexual behavior.
No, it doesn't.
Leviticus 18 lays out all these prohibitions.
Yeah, a whole set of prohibitions.
Right, and it seems like a lot of them are about maintaining social order
Right.
and family structures.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking specifically about the prohibitions against incest, adultery.
Right. Those are pretty universal taboos, even today.
Right, exactly.
So they likely served a very practical purpose, right?
Okay.
Preventing conflicts within families.
Right.
Preserving those kinship structures that were so fundamental.
But it's not just about avoiding societal chaos,
No.
right? It's also framed within this larger context of holiness.
Yeah, living in accordance with God's will.
And Leviticus also includes a prohibition against homosexuality.
Yeah, that's right.
And I know that that verse has been the subject of much debate and interpretation over the years.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do we approach that in a sensitive and informed way?
I think it's crucial to remember the historical and cultural context.
Right.
We can't impose our modern understandings of sexuality and morality onto these ancient texts.
So we might not agree with everything,
Right.
but we can still try to understand it in its own
yeah.
context.
Right. It's about approaching these texts with respect, but also with critical thinking.
Yeah, and one thing that I thought was interesting is that Leviticus 18, it doesn't just list those prohibitions.
Right.
It gives a reason.
It does. Yeah, it often emphasizes that these are the practices of the nations that were there before,
Okay.
and the Israelites are being called to be different.
So it's almost like a declaration of
Yeah.
their own cultural and religious identity.
Right. Setting themselves apart.
But it's not just about being different. It's about being better.
Yeah, striving for something more.
Right. Striving for holiness.
Exactly. That's the overarching theme.
Okay, so we've got those dietary laws, those sexual prohibitions,
Mm-hmm.
this idea of holiness.
Mm-hmm.
But Leviticus goes even further, right?
It does, yeah.
Talks about consequences.
Yeah, there are consequences for disobedience.
And some of them seem pretty harsh, even for back then.
Yes, they do.
So what's the message there? Is it just about fear and control?
I think it's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Remember, for the Israelites, these transgressions weren't just personal failings.
Okay.
They were offenses against God.
Right.
Violations of the covenant.
Yeah.
Threats to the community's well-being.
So it's about maintaining that covenant, maintaining that social order.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not just physical punishment. There's also this idea of bearing iniquity or sin.
Right, and that points to a spiritual consequence.
Okay.
Sin creates separation from God.
Okay.
A spiritual impurity that needs to be addressed.
Interesting. So it's a complex view of sin and what it actually means.
Yeah.
Now, as we go through Leviticus,
Mm-hmm.
there's one group that really stands out.
Right, the priests.
The priests, right?
Yeah.
They had a really unique and demanding role.
They did.
And Leviticus devotes several chapters to outlining all these regulations that apply to them.
Right, yeah, and these regulations, they really emphasize the elevated status of the priests and the importance of maintaining that ritual purity in their service to God.
So what are some of the things that set them apart?
Well, for starters, their marriage rules were much stricter.
Okay.
A high priest, for example, was required to marry a virgin from his own people.
Okay.
Widows, divorced women, or those who had been sexually active outside of marriage were off limits.
Okay, so it's about preserving the purity of that priestly lineage.
Yeah, exactly. They were seen as representatives of God.
Right, so they're held to a higher standard.
Yeah, a higher standard of purity and conduct.
And that emphasis on purity extended to their appearance as well, right?
Yes, it did.
I remember reading that priests with physical blemishes couldn't perform certain duties.
Right. Blindness, lameness, skin diseases, all of those were seen as disqualifying.
Interesting. It's like they believed that physical wholeness was a reflection of spiritual purity.
Right.
So how do they reconcile that with the fact that people get sick?
That's a good question.
And injured?
Yeah.
It's a very different worldview from our own.
It is. But remember, these regulations weren't meant to be cruel or discriminatory.
Yeah.
They stemmed from this deep-seated belief that the priests were set apart.
Right.
And that maintaining their purity was essential for the entire community.
Right. So it's about understanding that context.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to those regulations about marriage and appearance, Leviticus also outlines specific instructions for how the priests should behave.
Right. Inside and outside the tabernacle.
Right. So, like, what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, everything from restrictions on drinking alcohol before entering the tabernacle to guidelines for mourning rituals.
Interesting. So it was really about maintaining this state of...
Yeah, ritual purity.
Purity at all times.
Yeah, physical and mental clarity.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Wow. It must have been tough to be a priest.
It was a demanding role.
Right, balancing those human experiences with those sacred duties.
But it was also considered an immense honor.
Right.
These regulations really underscore those unique responsibilities.
Okay, now before we move on, I want to touch on one more thing.
Okay.
About the priests. Their garments.
Ah, yes, the garments.
Leviticus describes them in great detail, emphasizing the beauty and the symbolism.
They were more than just clothes.
Right.
They were visual representations of their sacred role, their connection to God.
And Leviticus is very specific about the materials and the design.
Yeah, we read about linen coats, linen breeches, linen girdles.
It seems like linen was the fabric of choice.
And there's a reason for that.
Okay.
Linen was associated with purity and holiness. It was also a costly fabric to produce.
Okay, so it sets them apart visually.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's also mention of a breastplate with the Urim and Thummim inside.
Ah, yes, the Urim and Thummim.
What were those?
Those are some of the most mysterious elements of the priestly attire.
Okay.
They were likely used for divination.
Okay.
Perhaps as a way to seek guidance from God.
So we don't really know.
No, the precise function remains a mystery.
So it's like a glimpse into another realm.
Yeah, it really is.
Of religious practice that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Now, before we move on to the final part, our Leviticus deep dive, I have a question for you.
Okay, shoot.
What do you think motivated the Israelites to adhere to these laws? Was it fear of punishment? A genuine desire for holiness?
That's a great question. question.
Or maybe a bit of both.
I think it's probably a combination of factors. Well, I imagine it was a bit of both, right? I mean, the consequences for disobedience were pretty severe.
Right. We talked about
But
that.
I also think there was a genuine desire to please God,
Okay.
to live in a way that honored their covenant with him.
So it's not just about avoiding punishment. It's about striving for something more.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in Leviticus.
We have.
But there's one more ritual
Okay.
that I think we need to talk about.
Ah.
It's one that's kind of captured the imagination for centuries.
Right.
The scapegoat.
Ah, yes, the scapegoat.
Leviticus 16 describes this ritual in detail.
It's a powerful image.
Right.
Very evocative.
So on the Day of Atonement,
Hmm.
the high priest would take 2 goats
Okay.
and present them before the Lord.
Right.
And then lots were cast, one for the Lord
Okay.
and one for Azazel.
Right. Which is often translated as scapegoat.
So what's the significance of those 2 goats?
Well, that word, azel, it's a bit of a mystery.
Okay.
Some scholars think it refers to a wilderness demon
Okay.
or a place of utter desolation.
Right.
Others see it as more of a symbolic representation
Okay.
of something outside the community,
Okay.
a place where impurity could be banished.
So one goat is sacrificed to the Lord, but what about the other one?
Well, the high priest would lay his hands on the head of that live goat, the
Oh, yeah.
scapegoat,
Okay.
and confess all the sins of the Israelites over it,
Okay.
symbolically transferring their sins onto the animal.
So it's like a physical embodiment.
Yeah, an embodiment of their sin.
Other than that.
And then that goat was driven out into the wilderness,
Wow. So it's carrying away.
carrying away the burden of their guilt.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is.
Any idea why a goat?
Well, goats in ancient Israel, they were often associated with the wilderness,
Okay.
untamed nature.
Okay.
So they were seen as kind of separate. Okay.
From the cultivated world.
Right, outside.
Right. Outside.
So that makes sense.
And they were also somewhat expendable,
Right, not as essential as sheep or cattle.
Exactly.
Okay, so all of that kind of plays into...
Yeah, it all feeds into that symbolism
Okay.
of carrying away impurity.
Now, this wasn't an everyday thing, right?
No, it was specifically tied to the Day of Atonement.
Okay, and remind us again what was so special about that day.
Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it was the most solemn day of the year.
Okay.
It was a day of fasting, introspection, and communal repentance.
Okay.
It was the day when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies,
Right. The most sacred space.
the most sacred space within the tabernacle,
Okay.
to offer sacrifices and seek forgiveness on behalf of everyone.
So the scapegoat ritual was a key part of this.
Yeah, it provided a tangible way for the Israelites to confront their guilt,
Okay.
experience a sense of purification.
So it's this idea of new beginnings, wiping the slate clean.
Exactly.
Now, as we wrap up...
Our Leviticus journey.
Yeah.
I want to go back to that idea of holiness,
Okay.
because Leviticus really emphasizes that, right?
It does. Be holy because God is holy.
But what does that actually mean?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And it's not a simple answer.
Okay.
Holiness in Leviticus, it's not just about avoiding sin.
Right.
It's about cultivating a way of life
Okay.
that reflects God's character.
Okay.
It's a life marked by purity, righteousness, compassion, justice.
It's more than just following rules.
It is, yeah.
It's about really aligning your inner self
Right,
with God.
with God's will.
And you see that throughout Leviticus and all the laws and the rituals.
Right, it's all connected.
Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that Leviticus can be a tough book
Mm-hmm.
for modern readers.
Yeah, for sure.
Some of the laws seem strange
Yeah, even offensive.
to us today,
Right.
but I think we've shown that there's more to it than that.
Absolutely. It's important to approach these texts with respect, but also with a critical eye.
Right?
Yeah.
We need to understand the historical and cultural context,
Right.
but also engage with those deeper questions.
So it's about learning from the past,
Hmm.
wrestling with those difficult questions,
Yeah,
and finding those truths that are still relevant.
exactly. I think in doing so, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities
Mhm.
of this ancient society.
Right.
You know, the power of ritual and symbolism.
Yeah.
And ultimately that human search for meaning.
Yeah, that search for connection with something greater than ourselves.
Exactly.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into Leviticus.
Okay.
But before we go,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with a thought to ponder.
Right.
What if Leviticus were being written today
Ooh, that's a good one.
for a modern audience?
Mm-hmm.
What laws and rituals would be included?
Yeah, what would change?
What values would be emphasized?
Yeah, how would it be different?
What would a modern-day call to holiness sound like?
That's something to think about.
Yeah, we'd love to share your thoughts.
Until next time, keep diving deep